We've got a tremendous opportunity here this morning to have one of the preeminent experts on education reform with us. Dr. Finn, I first met Dr. Finn probably a dozen or more years ago, prior to the Quality Basic Education Reform Initiative in Georgia. Governor Harris brought him down in the early 80s when he was on faculty at Vanderbilt. And a lot of the problems he identified at that time, a lot of the solutions that he identified at that time, which would have served us quite well, we, in our infinite wisdom, chose in Georgia not to pay heed to what his advice was. I hope this time around, Dr. Finn, that we have a little more wisdom to pay attention. But without further ado, and you've got his biography at your table, but let me ask you to give a warm welcome to Dr. Chester Finn.
Thank you, Griff, and thank you, everybody, not least for coming. Getting up early on a damp morning to go hear some carpetbagger talk about education problems is not everybody's idea of fun. And I'm really grateful to you for turning out and for inviting me to be with you this morning. And then a little later today at this education summit that Linda Schrenko has organized that's been going on across town yesterday and today. You've certainly been busy in Georgia with education reform schemes and strategies, and it seems to me a little guerrilla warfare from time to time. You appear not to have the results you want or need yet, but heaven knows the effort is worth making. My purpose this morning is to say why that's so and to place some of what you're about in a bit of a larger context. The essence of our education problem today, as you well know, and for at least the last 20 years, was that young Americans aren't learning nearly enough for their own or the nation's good. It's too early to trot out a lot of statistics, so let me illustrate the point with I hope a mildly light digression with some student bloopers collected by Richard Lederer in New Hampshire, who goes around asking teachers to send him their best excerpts from student papers at the junior high and high school level, which he then collects and publishes. So here's a little bit of evidence about the need for education reform in America from student papers. The inhabitants of ancient Egypt were called mummies, and they all wrote in hydraulics. They lived in the Sahara Desert and traveled by camelot. The climate of the Sahara is such that the inhabitants have to live elsewhere. So certain areas of the desert are cultivated by irritation. The pyramids are a range of mountains between France and Spain. The Egyptians built the pyramids in the shape of a triangular cube. Pharaoh forced the Hebrew slaves to make bread without straw. Moses led them to the Red Sea, where they made unleavened bread, which is bread without any ingredients. Afterward, Moses went up on Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments. He died before he ever reached Canada. Skipping over a couple of centuries, Socrates was another famous Greek teacher who went around giving people advice. They killed him. Socrates died from an overdose of wedlock. After his death, his career suffered a dramatic decline. Eventually, the Romans conquered the Greeks. History calls people Romans because they never stayed in one place for very long. And skipping over a millennium or so, the greatest writer of the futile ages was Chaucer, who wrote many poems and verses and also wrote literature. During this time, people put on morality plays about ghosts, goblins, virgins, and other mythical creatures. Martin Luther was nailed to the church door at Wittenberg for selling his papal indulgences. He died a horrible death, being excommunicated by a bull. It was the painter Donatello's interest in the female nude that made him the father of the Renaissance. Well, it goes on, and so does the problem. We have a lot of young people of every hue and socioeconomic class who are not learning very much, who are not learning enough for their own good or for the state's good or for the country's good. Just a couple of numbers on this. On the 1994 National Assessment of Reading, that most basic of skills, just 1/3 of U.S. high school seniors were proficient readers, and almost 1/3 of them, this is just a few months before they got their diplomas, could scarcely read. In 4th grade, where we have comparative state data from a lot of states, in Georgia, 26% of your 4th graders in 1994 were good readers. That 26 compares with 28% nationally. But 48% of your 4th graders were, as they say at national assessment, below basic, 48%. That compares with 41% nationally. This means that in 4 or 5 years of school, almost half the children of this state have not got the most important of all the educational basics under their belts yet. What does it mean to be nearing the end of 4th grade without being able to read? Well, I think you can answer that question as well as I can. Maybe once upon a time, this was a country that could get by with only a small fraction of its population learning a lot, while most of its children learned only a little. But it isn't that kind of a world today, and it won't be a very bright future unless we can radically alter our present educational performance. The nub of our problem, indisputably, is weak academic achievement, even among those who complete formal schooling, even among those who complete formal schooling in upper middle class suburbs where everybody's very smug and complacent about how great their schools are, but the fact of the matter is their kids aren't learning very much either. Weak achievement, however, is not the only story in American education. Unfortunately, it's more complicated than that. There are some other elements that have to be understood in order for this problem to be, I think, fully grasped. And I'm going to mention 10 of these other elements right now. The first, of course, is children at risk. Besides millions of middle-class kids emerging half-ignorant from those suburban schools, U.S. education finds itself dealing with hundreds of thousands of underclass youngsters whose lives are messed up in numerous ways, including, but not limited to, the fact that they aren't learning very much in school. The education debate moves very confusingly between these two problems, the solutions to which overlap but are seldom identical. Second, the school's limited leverage to do anything in the first place. School occupies a surprisingly slender portion of American children's lives. I did the calculations once. A youngster who faithfully attends class in a typical American school 6 hours a day, 180 days a year for 13 years from kindergarten through 12th grade without missing a single day of school will, upon reaching his 18th birthday, have spent 9% of his hours on earth under the school's roof and 91% of his hours on earth elsewhere. Now, under optimal circumstances, a lot of learning can take place during that 9%. But what if the 91% is not cooperating? How much can the 9% compensate for a misguided or wasted 91%? And especially, how much can the 9% do if, in addition to history and geography and science and math, if that same 9% is also expected to prevent AIDS and stop drug abuse and reduce the rate of teen pregnancy and substitute for family and church and do a wide variety of other things that we tend to lay on the schools without expanding the 9% of the children's lives that they are responsible for. Not enough leverage to do all that we're asking of the schools. Third, no clear standards or expectations. One simple, obvious reason that American students don't learn what they ought is that the education system is so nebulous about what it expects them to learn. That's changing a little bit at the national level, and in a number of states. I know you've been working hard at standards in Georgia, but we've got a heck of a way to go still here. How many parents today actually know in any way that they can describe what the schools expect their children to learn? How many parents could describe what their children are supposed to have learned by the end of the year, and thus be able to monitor it? Moreover, many recent efforts to specify school outcomes have been skimpy on knowledge and skills, but overfull of attitudes and behavior and interpersonal relationships. That's produced the furor over outcomes-based education, which in turn has produced a major setback for what I'll call standards-based education. Fourth, the dearth of reliable information. Besides not having specs for the products that the education system ought to be producing, we haven't got good information on the results that we're actually producing. There's no counterpart in education to what business terms the independent audit. None. It's as if in education we're obliged to rely on the company treasurer's word for whether the company was profitable or not. And nobody ever looked at the books. It's practically impossible for parents to obtain reliable, intelligible information about how their child and their child's school are actually doing in relation to how they ought to be doing. Fifth, there are few real-world consequences for young people, at least not tangible enough that they can feel. Even as people lament the poor quality of their applicants, not very many universities or employers distinguish between the candidates who took hard courses, learned a lot, and did well in school, and those who took the path of least resistance, got by with C's, and learned very little. There is one important exception to that, and that is the 50 or so elite colleges and universities in the country for which entry is genuinely competitive. People applying to those 50 or so places actually do get rewarded for studying hard. But that's less than 5% of all American high school students. And everybody else knows that there's a college down the road that will be happy to have them no matter what, and that their employer won't even look at their transcript. Let alone reward them differentially on the basis of whether they did well in school or badly. Kids, in their own peculiar way, are rational beings. And if they figure out that it doesn't really matter, they're probably not going to do more than is absolutely necessary. Sixth, no systematic accountability. As Bill Bennett once noted, there are, in his words, greater, more certain, and more immediate penalties in this country for serving up a single rotten hamburger in a restaurant than for repeatedly furnishing 1,000 school children with a rotten education, unquote. You get your restaurant closed down by the health authorities if you serve spoiled food. And what happens when you serve spoiled education? They send more money to your school. Think about it. Those managing the education system are largely held harmless from accountability for that system's results, good or bad. A principal or superintendent is much more likely to lose his job for trying to change things than for quietly running a system that produces wretched results year in and year out. There are few rewards for the successful. There is very little unpleasantness for those who fail. And that's because, point 7, nearly all the power rests with the system, not with its customers and not even with its online professionals. One might suppose that public education was designed to serve the public interest and to be accountable to the public for its performance. Today, however, one would be wrong about that. Today, most effective power resides within the education establishment, an interlocked directorate that includes the teacher unions, the administrators, a dozen other employee groups, surprisingly docile state and local school boards. Well, maybe your state board's not so docile, just a little odd. But in most cases, surprisingly docile state and local school boards, textbook and test publishers, and colleges of education. This interlocking directorate basically makes the decisions and pulls most of the levers. Point 8, that same school establishment has a near monopoly. In any location, there is but one public school system. Attendance is mandatory, and the particular school one attends is assigned by the system. The well-to-do can loosen that grip of that monopoly, either by taking up residence in another town or by paying for their children to attend private schools. For the poor, this is much, much harder. As I think we know, monopolies are seldom responsive to consumer preferences, and government monopolies are even less responsive. Ninth, there's a wide gap between what the public thinks is wrong and what interests most of the experts. Surveys by the Public Agenda Foundation make plain that the American public is interested above all in safety, discipline, order, and the basics in its schools, while the experts are more interested in mixed ability grouping, authentic assessment, and problem solving. I oversimplify, but there really are two separate agendas here, almost like ships passing in the night. And 10th and last in this list, we have an archaic school design. Even our good schools aren't nearly what they should be, because nearly all of them follow a 19th century formula. This is true, incidentally, of private as well as public institutions. Thus, we find a school year designed for the agrarian age, when the kids were needed to bring in the crops and nobody had invented air conditioning. We find a school day designed for the days when mom was at home at 2:45 with milk and cookies and a ride to the scout meeting. We find primitive technology. I mean, most American classrooms do not possess a telephone, let alone anything that you would think of as modern technology. We have obsolete notions of how children learn effectively. We have unbelievably dull materials. We have a bureaucratic management system that prizes conformity, with a vast middle management system that most businesses have by now eliminated. And we have a tendency to judge quality by how much is spent, how many adults are present, and what services they provide, rather than by what the children actually learn. Well, what have we been doing about this? At least since 1983, when we were declared a nation at risk, a lot of states and localities have been endeavoring to reform their education systems. And these reform efforts have taken 1,000 different forms. I could spend the rest of the morning just listing the kinds of things we've tried to do in the name of reform. But virtually all of these efforts have taken place within the old ground rules of a single, big, essentially uniform, centrally run, government-based, monopolistic public school system. It seems to me unsurprising that these reform efforts have not borne very much fruit. They couldn't bear much fruit, given the assumptions within which they are obliged to work. Keeping the ground rules unchanged pretty much assures that the results will be unchanged. Fortunately, there are signs today of a second education reform paradigm slowly getting established in America, though with a lot of kicking and screaming. This alternative approach, this second reform paradigm, welcomes decentralized control, entrepreneurial management, grassroots initiatives within a framework of publicly defined standards and accountability. Under this second approach, public officials establish standards, make assessments, and hold schools accountable for meeting goals, but do not themselves run the schools. I think we could call this reinventing public education, because in this approach, schools may be run by diverse providers and groups and organizations, not just by government agencies. Historically, we've defined a public school as a school run by a government bureaucracy. Well, what if we instead defined a public school as a school that's open to the public, financed by the public, accountable to the public, but could be run by anybody? And could be staffed by anybody, and could be run in a lot of different ways. In this paradigm, education may be delivered through charter schools, through opt-out schools, as they say in England, that secede from their local education agencies and run themselves with what amounts to a block grant of money, contract schools in which a performance contract is negotiated between an educational manager, often private, sometimes corporate, and a public agency, school choice programs in which students use scholarships or vouchers to attend the schools of their choice, increasingly now including private schools as well as public schools. This reinvention paradigm, as I'm calling it, welcomes diverse schools organized and run by diverse entities, such as teacher cooperatives, parent associations, private companies, some places religious organizations, community groups. It takes for granted that students and families differ, and that students and families should be free to match themselves to the schools that suit them best. It requires little bureaucracy, or at least less bureaucracy, and fewer regulations, because it rejects the proposition that schools must be centrally managed according to a single formula. These two approaches, the kind of big government paradigm and this reinvention paradigm, are now competing with each other, both at the national level and in the states. In Georgia, as far as I can tell from a distance, the old paradigm, the big government one, is still largely intact, and the interests that benefit from it are largely in charge. Your wimpy charter school law is a pretty good example of this. Of the 25 or so states that have enacted charter legislation, Georgia's is among the weakest. It allows only existing schools to get charters. It keeps them part of their local school districts. It grants them little real autonomy. It keeps most of the crucial decisions with the local school systems, which are precisely what charter schools come into existence to escape from. That's why you've got only a handful of charter schools, and most of those aren't much more than what in other places are called site-managed schools. Not a bad thing. Nothing wrong, good thing, but not a great thing, and certainly not what it could be. The contrast between Georgia and places like Arizona, Michigan, Massachusetts, and Texas could not be more profound when it comes to charter schools. Let me say just a couple more words about charter schools, because I've been spending a lot of my life these last 2 years traveling the country visiting them. During the discussion period, if you want to turn to the other two frontiers of the new paradigm, the voucher idea and the private management of public school idea, just say so, because there's a lot of activity on both those fronts today, too. Two colleagues and I concluded last summer, after visiting 43 charter schools last year in 7 states, that, as we wrote, charter schools may be the most vibrant force in American education today. As I believe you know, charter schools, at least real ones, are independent public schools exempt from most state regulations and freed from bureaucratic control by the superintendent's office, free to decide what to teach and how to teach it, whom to hire and how to deploy their resources, what hours to operate, and how best to meet their students' needs. Some schools, at least in other states, achieve charter status by seceding from their local school systems, while others are new institutions founded by teachers or parents or community groups. What makes them so promising as a reform strategy is that they are accountable for results rather than for following rules. A charter typically lasts 5 years, at the end of which it is renewed if and only if that school has reached the goals it set for itself. Public authorities thus retain final say over these new-style public schools, which are tax-financed, tuition-free, and open to everyone that wants to come. But the schools are spared from daily bureaucratic supervision and are encouraged to be different. And most of those we visited were different indeed. Their walls all but vibrated with high-quality teaching and learning. Yet charter schools have more enemies than allies. A few of their opponents are to be found on the right, among people who believe that any school called public is inevitably tainted by association with government, and that any reform of the public education system, however appealing, will only slow the quest for vouchers. Most charter foes, however, see themselves as liberals. Their motives are mixed, often including self-interested protection of the government and union monopoly. But self-interest customarily wears at least the fig leaf of concern for needy children, and sometimes that concern is genuine. By far the most frequently voiced criticism of charter schools by their opponents is that they will cream the ablest, most fortunate, and best-parented kids, leaving behind the poor, the disabled, the minorities in so-called regular schools that will become dumping grounds, etc., etc., etc. Maybe the most important finding of our research last year is that this allegation is a fantasy. The 34 schools on which we gathered student data for this past year, charter schools, 7 states, are a pretty good cross-section of the charter universe. And here is what we learned about the 8,400 students who attended those schools last year. 63% of the kids were non-white, 55% of them were poor, that is to say, eligible for the federal free and reduced lunch program. 19% of them had limited English proficiency. 19% had some kind of disabilities that affect their education. 4% were former dropouts. Incidentally, 10% came from private schools or home schools into these public charter schools. Another very interesting development, which the interpretation of which depends, I think, on where you sit. If you're the head of a private school, you may have a different view of this. And if, on the other hand, you're the state budget director saying, you mean we wouldn't be paying for 10% of these kids if we didn't have these charter schools? You also might have a different view of this. Far from enrolling the best and the brightest or the richest and the whitest, charter schools are attracting kids in acute need of alternatives, youngsters who were ill-served by the regular schools and who didn't thrive there. We came to think of these kids as square peg youngsters who do not fit into the round holes of conventional public or private schools. Such a pupil population doesn't make it easy for charter schools, by the way. One principal compared his school's admissions process to the Mariel boat lift. In his words, we got a lot of good ones, but also a few crazies. On the other hand, one superintendent in a rural Colorado district told me that his schools were much more tranquil now because, quote, the charter school rounded up all the troublemakers. Far from creaming, one might say that charter schools are dealing with a lot of the skim milk that the regular dairy cannot or will not handle. Yet, despite this early evidence of responsiveness to some of the neediest kids in the country, charter schools still have many dogged foes in the education establishment. These enemies have striven with fair success, and Georgia's a pretty good example, to keep charter schools few and weak by capping their numbers, by cramping their autonomy, limiting their funds. That's why so many charter laws make it hard to launch viable charter schools, and for those schools that do get launched in many states, far from being handed a bucket of public money to do with whatever they like, with no accountability, as critics also allege, on the contrary, charter schools in too many states continue to be burdened by myriad rules and procedures, nor are they fully funded. Most lack access to capital funding. Most don't have facilities provided. In many cases, there's no startup money, and the public dollars don't flow until the kids turn up, which makes it a little hard to plan your curriculum and train your teachers. Many are given less than their full share of per-pupil operating funds, or are forced to hand substantial fractions of their budgets back to the local district in rent or overhead payments of one kind or another. The upshot is that a majority of charter schools must make do with less money than conventional public schools while being expected to produce superior results. Interesting. Why then am I enthusiastic about this? We can't even tell you for certain that their pupils are learning more. They're too new to have any kind of conclusive achievement data. But we do know from sitting in many classrooms and interviewing hundreds of students and parents and teachers that these schools radiate learning. They fulfill parents' demands for safety, order, basic skills, and dedicated teachers. They are mostly small schools in which everyone knows everyone else's face, schools with clear missions and distinctive philosophies, schools full of adults and children who want to be there. Not a bad recipe for educational success. Let me end then by recapping the essential characteristics of this second paradigm of education reform, the one I hope you will now follow in Georgia. 5 essential characteristics. First, power shifting. Paradigm 2 entails transferring quite a lot of decision-making authority, political power, and control over resources from producers to consumers, from managers to doers, from experts to civilians, and from the government knows best monopoly to a much more diverse and flexible delivery system. Second, standards. Looseness as to the means of education must be accompanied by greater coherence about the ends of education. Any well-functioning enterprise begins with clarity about its expectations. Indeed, I believe that only when we can articulate our destination have we any chance of getting there. Third, accountability. Paradigm 2 swaps bureaucratic-style regulatory accountability for 2 other kinds: accountability to consumers via the marketplace and accountability to those issuing charters, accrediting schools, and writing those management contracts. These are mechanisms with real consequences for everyone involved, and thus it's a real accountability system. Fourth, acceptance of supply-side pluralism, which is to say, other than whatever common core of skills and knowledge is written into those charters and contracts, the second paradigm takes for granted that schools should be expected to differ along just about every other dimension. This is too big a country and too diverse a society to expect a single model to fit everybody. And fifth and finally, demand-side choice. Schools shouldn't be the same because people aren't the same. But as schools come to differ from one another, people need to be able to match themselves up with the version they think will work best for them. I don't see school choice as a panacea, but I do think it's the essential lubricant of a reformed education system. That reformed system, however, isn't going to establish itself. Getting there is going to require sustained pressure from outside, and it seems to me that's where people like you and groups like this one come in. The Georgia Public Policy Foundation is a fine example of just the sort of organization that is the crucial ingredient of any real education change in America. To repeat, the system is not going to reform itself. Allowed to do its own thing, it will continue to do tomorrow what it did yesterday. It has that much inertia, it has that much momentum, and it has that much self-interest in maintaining the status quo. So you and people like you are going to have to figure out how to organize, how to strategize, how to leverage change in a system that doesn't want to change, but whose change is absolutely essential to the future of this community and this state and all the kids in this country. And I thank you very much.